Sorry it took me so long to get this next installment of the Gospel of Mark study up and running. But we are excited. I'm excited to take on the 13th chapter as we move increasingly closer to the climax of the Gospel of Mark, where we look at the crucifixion and, more importantly, resurrection of Jesus. And glad we get to do this together. Doing it again from the council here at the sound booth, so we can see some scripture verses as well. So I'm going to slide that on over, and we'll be able to look at these together. Unfortunately, right now I'm on the Timothy passage, so we'll get that squared away. As he was leaving, you'll see the temple, one of the disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." Keep in mind that the disciples were, for the most part, well, country bumpkins might be a little bit too harsh of a phrase, a little bit too derogatory, but something along that line. They were predominantly from Galilee, and the temple, of course, was an incredibly massive, incredibly beautiful building. And so it was something that caught their attention. It was something that they would have noticed, and that most anybody would notice. I remember distinctly being in Washington, D.C. a few years back, and Washington, D.C. was built on the premise that it would be a home court advantage because of the layout, the impressiveness of the buildings, and so forth, that foreign dignitaries coming in from other countries would be kind of awed and wowed by what they saw in D.C. And the temple in Jerusalem had that same kind of effect. It was really impossible to come there and not be impressed by what was seen. Jesus, of course, though, is operating on a different wavelength, and we see that in his response. Do you see all these buildings? Now, one stone will be left on another; every one will be thrown down. So, while the disciples are awestruck by the temple, Jesus is more keen on the temporal nature, the fleeting nature of the temple. He predicts the destruction of the temple, which occurred in 70 AD. So this is a forward-looking, kind of a prophetic statement. We have to remember that Mark's gospel was written around the time leading up to the destruction of the temple. If we place the writing of the Gospel of Mark in 60 or so AD, it's a full decade before the temple is destroyed. So it launches them into this kind of future horizon. And Jesus is really trying to get his disciples to dial in on the future, both the near and midterm and then long-term future. And this launches out into a long-term future discussion. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign that they are all about to be fulfilled?" Now, eschatological thinking, the return of Christ kind of thinking, is, or the end of the age kind of thinking, was built into Jewish thought because of statements made in the Minor Prophets, but particularly what is written in the book of Daniel. And so there was a eschatological climax to human history assumption here. And they see the destruction, the disciples do, they see the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem as essentially a synonymous event with the apocalypse or the end of the age. And so they're asking Jesus those kinds of questions. But notice again how there's absolutely no separation of these themes whatsoever. And it's interesting that Jesus does not correct their overlapping of the destruction of the temple and the end of the age. Again, he doesn't feel the need to put their chronology straight. Instead, he puts their heart and mind straight, and he focuses in on that. And Jesus said to them, "Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come claiming, 'I am he,' and will deceive many." So the first warning that Jesus gives his followers, having really not giving consideration to changing their chronological misgivings, but really getting into their attitude, their mindset, and he warns them, don't be deceived. What has always amazed me as you study as you study church history, and you look at the various spin-offs of the various cults and other things that have kind of degenerated forms of Christianity, a lot of them are built on or were inaugurated on bogus eschatological and apocalyptic stuff. I don't really want to go down the road of naming all of the groups, but it is a fairly consistent theme. They either change the identity of Jesus or they really goof up and botch his second coming. And so clearly this warning that Jesus gives was very apropos, very needed, and yet has gone largely unheeded by the human race. I shouldn't say largely unheeded, in significant ways unheeded by humans. So it's unfortunate that we haven't taken our Lord serious on this point. No one knows the hour. There is much that concerning the end of the age that we don't understand, and there will be many who will try to falsify the return of Christ. So these are the warnings, and if you miss those warnings, your heart is not in keeping, with the Lord's. Jesus then paints a stark picture about the events that will precede the end of the age. Notice in the way that he tenses his verbs in this sentence, such things must happen, but the end is still to come. He's essentially setting up the wars, rumors of wars, as precursory, as in terms of sequence and in order, that which must come first before the end. Wars, rumors of wars. If I were to use a English word that I think is very fitting in this moment, and I've used it quite a bit in my preaching lately, it's the word chaos. You hear of wars and rumors of wars. I would just summarize that in English with chaos. When you see chaos, don't be alarmed. These things must happen. This theme of not being concerned about the end of the age, because we recognize the chaos that must come, is a very significant piece of how do I want to say this? Is a significant piece of the teaching of Revelation as well. And so there's quite a bit of agreement between the apocalypse of John's writing and the words of Jesus. Quite a bit of agreement amongst them that these kind of things must occur. He then Jesus gives further illustration of this war, rumors of war, picture this chaos. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be earthquakes in various places and famines. And these are all the beginning of birth pains. This theme of birth pains is a theme that arises also in the book of Revelation. It was a metaphor to describe the pain, suffering, and the hardship that gives way to great joy. And that's why giving birth became a very befitting metaphor for what we anticipate the end of the age to be like. We envision struggle, hardship, pain, and suffering that gives way to great joy that eclipses the pain and suffering. And so the follower of Christ when we see chaos around us, when we see wars, rumors of wars, nations rising against nations, kingdom against kingdoms, we see earthquakes, we see things occurring in the physical environment, and we see the impact that has, and we see shortages of food. When we see all of these hardships and struggles, we categorize them as the birth pains that are going to give way to a eclipsing, surpassing joy. And so the Christian is not, should not, ought not to be surprised nor shaken by these kinds of events. I don't think that we are wise to necessarily read into every modern event and try to place it in an eschatological scheme. I think that's a little bit of an unwise thing. I think we are to approach this more broadly in recognizing that this unsettling events are confirmation of our faith. We should never be brought to question and doubt our faith because of the struggle and hardship that are occurring in our world. They are confirmation that our faith is well placed, because our Lord has told us point blank to anticipate them. Now that's particularly important for the disciples, has immediate application for them, because they are about to go through the agonizing loss of seeing their Messiah, their Lord, crucified and killed. And they themselves, post that, are going to endure hardships and be martyred. And so this theme must be cemented in their heart. So rather than trying to tweak their chronology, Jesus is really trying to get their hearts ready for the struggle that's ahead, both in the immediate with his death, and then a little bit longer term in the context of their suffering. Jesus then gives one objective criteria in Mark 13:10 that defines when the end of the age will come. There is one basic task, if you will, that remains unfulfilled when Christ is crucified, and that is the completion of preaching the Gospels to all nations. This objective, this goal of preaching the gospel to all nations, is rooted in the Abrahamic covenant. We were told in the book of Genesis that the promise given to Abraham entailed that through the seed of Abraham, God would bless all the nations. And that is fleshed out in the gospel being preached to all nations, and we see in Revelation then the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant when we see the throne room of God and the great multitude before that from every tribe, nation, every ethnos, as it's written in Greek, there worshiping before the living God. So that image then becomes an incredibly important piece of our missional approach to life and our eschatological understanding. Jesus is not coming back until the mission is complete. We are to give ourselves wholeheartedly to that mission. Going on to verse 11. Whenever you are arrested and brought to trial, do not worry beforehand about what to say. Just say whatever is given to you at that time, for it is not you speaking, but the Holy Spirit. Here Jesus is giving very specific instruction to his followers in the setting of being put on trial. Again, this is the kind of hardship, this is what we should anticipate, this is the norm, this is not the deviation, this is the norm for the follower of God as we live out our difficult days in this time of chaos. And so Jesus wants his followers to understand not to rehearse their story over and over again. It's interesting how people, when we are faced with anxiety-causing, anxiety-inducing situations, we tend to want to rehearse our story. We might start rehearsing our story, like for instance, when we're getting our driver's license and registration ready for a police officer who has pulled us over. We might have our pre-canned, here's our story kind of a thing ready to go. We see this in Jesus' parable of the prodigal son. He rehearses his story before he tries to share that with his father. And Jesus is very clear, Don't try to come with a pre-canned, pre-sorted, rehearsed message. But in those moments of great struggle, find a great dependency upon the Holy Spirit for what it is we will need. Jesus goes on to give another picture of what the end will look like. Brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child. Children will rebel against their parents and have them put to death. This is the disintegration of the home, and this is a world marred by violence. So up until this point, Jesus has covered kind of cataclysmic events, earthquakes. He's talked about suffering in the sense of famine. He's touched on all of the things that are going on under the sun in our day and have really for the last multitude of years, number of years, really tried to portray all these things so that none of them are upsetting or catching his followers off guard. Jesus even goes so far as to warn his followers that they will be hated, that their standing for God will place them out of the good graces of many, many people. In 14, verse 14, Jesus makes a direct reference to the book of Daniel. The abomination that causes desolation was a statement made in the book of Daniel about when the end is yet to come. Depending on your particular eschatology, you either see this as yet to be fulfilled in a third temple, and just as a kind of an explanation of that phrase, third temple, just keep in mind that there was the first temple built by Solomon. There was a second temple built after the exile. It became known as Herod's temple. First one was often referred to as the Solomon's temple. Second one, Herod's temple, because a large refurbishing of that temple occurred during the reign of Herod the Great. And so some people see the abomination as causing desolation as a third temple, and others would go down the road of seeing this as fulfilled by Epiphanes, who sacrificed a pig on the altar before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So however you want to frame that eschatologically, the key here again is that is the location. It's the location. Remember that this conversation began with the temple and the disciples calling attention to it. And as they sit on the Mount of Olives, which was only a few hundred yards away from the temple and easily visible across the Kidron Valley from the Mount of Olives, as they're literally just outside of the temple gates and doors, Jesus is able to even, probably point and look and say, right over there, this is going to happen. This abomination that causes desolation is going to occur. And let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. What Jesus is getting at here is that his people, his followers, and the nation of Israel will not be immune from the kind of disasters and calamity that are about to befall the world. So it's not that they're going to be insulated and inoculated from this chaos. They are going to very much live in the midst of it. He then gives further instruction for the Jewish people at the time of the abomination that causes desolation. He writes, let no one go to the roof of his house or go down to enter the house to take anything out. Let no one go into the field to get his cloak. In other words, when this event happens, it's time to run. It is time to flee. And there isn't moments to be wasted. And then he offers up how dreadful it will be those days for mothers. Pray that this will not take place in winter. It's going to be a tremendous blow to the Jewish people when the abomination that causes desolation occurs. Again, whether you frame that futuristically in an eschatological way, or whether you frame that in a historical way as referring to the sacrificing of a pig on the altar before its destruction in 69, 70 or so AD. Jesus' picture to his people is clear. It's going to be rough, and it's going to be a season of chaos. So if I can put it to you this way, hopefully this will make sense. Jesus is essentially painting what would be the worst case scenario for an Orthodox Jew, the desolation of the temple. And he talks about their worst case scenario as only a harbinger or a precursor event to the main event. So imagine your worst case scenario for life. God talking about that and describing it is really just a blip on the radar, a warming up before the real deal. That's how Jesus is describing these things to his followers. But in those days, there will be great distress, unequal from the beginning, when God created the world until now, and never to be equaled again. The apocalypse, the end of the age, is categorically unlike anything else. It far exceeds anything we've ever known. It's hard to think, in our historical setting, living in 2020, thinking back over what's occurred in the world over the last 100 years. We're talking about famines that are greater than what we've seen. We're talking about wars and rumors of wars that are greater than the Cold War, that are greater than World War II, that are greater than World War I, that are greater than Vietnam and Operation Iraqi Freedom and so forth. We're talking about something that's beyond even that. Hopefully that gives you a sense of the gravitas, the immensity of what we're coming up against when we think about those days at the end of the age. Jesus offers up this thought: if the Lord had not cut short those days, no one would survive. It is so calamitous that it carries with it the potential to completely annihilate the human species. We are talking about a life-altering event, not just for an individual, but for the whole human race. And then Jesus offers the rationale for why those days will be cut short, but because of the elect, whom he has chosen, he has shortened them. Again, I don't want to get into too much of the particulars of eschatology. I tend to take the track that we will live through the time of the tribulation. There are those who would disagree with me, and the Alliance takes an open stance on that. However, this is one verse that I would point to and say that the church is here through the tribulation, and that's why the tribulation is shortened. It's simply because there will not be the annihilation of the whole human race. Again, that's how I understand Jesus in this moment. You don't have to agree by any means on that one. And at that time, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it. Again, this goes back to the very first warning issued by Jesus, the don't be deceived warning. You are not going to go looking for the return of Christ. You are not going to have to go looking for it. It will be so evident, it will be so profound that it will be impossible to miss on at any level. So we don't have to go looking for the return of our Lord. It will be more than evidence. And then he again lays out the rationale for the warning. Many false prophets and Christ will appear. They'll perform many miracles. They'll try to deceive people. And we are not to get sucked into that. As followers of God, we are not to we're not to succumb to any pressure to believe that the Messiah has returned and we've missed it, or that somehow any of these jokers who are running around nowadays claiming to be the Christ are in fact the Christ. From David Koresh on down, they're all charlatans, they're all fakes, they're all imposters, they are not legitimate. The return of Christ will be so evident it will be impossible to miss. You won't have to ask, is this it? It will be self-evident. So be on your guard. I have told you ahead of time. I love that phrase. It's the, if you get this wrong, it is your fault. It is Jesus placing squarely and justifiably the responsibility on on the shoulders of his followers to be discerning and to be questioning kinds of people. I can't state this enough. It's your job to be a skeptic. It's your responsibility to search for truth, to know truth, to be able to create distinction and to sift out that which is true from that which is false. It's your responsibility, it's my responsibility, and it's no one else's job to do it for us. And we are told explicitly that there are going to be those out there who are going to try and deceive you. And so, be forewarned. That exists, they're out there. But in those days, following the distress, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. Jesus again goes down this road of painting in picture of that which is unmistakable. If we woke up tomorrow and the sun had been darkened and not giving its light like normal, I guarantee it you and I would notice. It's not something subtle. It's unmistakable. I remember a few years ago, a young lady who was probably elementary age for sure, probably 4th, 5th grade, greeted a woman at church and looked at her and said, "Wow, that's a really nice haircut." To which this middle-aged lady laughed quite loudly and said, "My husband didn't even notice." Subtle things, like a spouse getting a haircut. Well, at least if you're a guy, that's a subtle thing, and you may not even notice it. One of the things I joked about yesterday with Ernie, we were taking and repositioning stage lights, and one of our bulbs here is burned out, so we removed the light. And so there's 4 lights up there, one is missing. And I joked to Ernie, I said, "I wonder how many people even notice that light up there isn't where it's supposed to be. That bulb is missing. How many people even notice it?" Kind of a thing. It's subtle and it's out of sight, and it's something that we could easily bypass and not even realize it's there. The return of Christ is not like that. The return of Christ will be unmistakable, and we ought not to go looking or reading into things because it will become so evident. We see the sun being changed, the moon being changed, stars being changed. The cataclysmicness of this cannot be overstated. At that time, the men will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. There is we've come full circle. There is if you can think of it this way, there is the clincher, the defining moment. It's the return of the Son of Man. It's the return of Christ. That is the central and defining moment at which this age ends and the new age begins. That is when the clock, so to speak, strikes midnight. The return of Christ will encode his angels, and it will be a gathering from all the world, all people. Jesus, who had recently in Mark's Gospel cursed the fig tree, now uses the fig tree as an illustration. Learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as the twig gets tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. To put this in a contemporary setting for you and I to understand, when you smell the first lilacs, you know it's summer. When you smell the first few cuttings of grass, you know it's summer. In the Jewish world, in the world in which Jesus lived, when the fig tree starts to shoot its leaves, you know it's summer. So it's a defining moment. It's that exact precise moment you can say, hey, it's going to be summer now. And so we see the return of Christ. We see him coming on the clouds. His angels are going out to gather. We know this new season has started. Even so, when you see these things happen, know the end is near, right at the door. It's as if the marshal for the race has called all set, raised his hand and pointed his gun in the air and is ready to pull the trigger. We're right on the cusp of the start of this new part of the journey. I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away until these things have happened. There's a phrase that has been misunderstood. It was misunderstood in the days of the early church to mean that um, those followers of Christ, the very first generation, first century followers of Christ, would still be on the earth when he returned. That is not exactly what the direction Jesus is going in this moment. Jesus is not so much ensuring that the generation that he sees physically on the earth in the first century was going to be here when he returned. He is speaking more broadly in this moment. And a better way to think about the word generation is to see it more in terms of the human race generally. This era, this post-crucifixion / pre-return of Christ era, and this human race, those things are not going to pass away until all these things have been brought to fulfillment. No one knows the day or the hours, not even the angels in heaven. This really rounds out, in many ways, the biggest warning in all of the text. We've been warned not to be deceived by false Christ. We've been warned not to go looking for the return of Christ. That will become evident to all. We've been told to be on mission, that he is not returning until we've preached the gospel to all nations. Here we're told specifically, don't predict the hour. Don't buy into people who are trying to tell you their prediction of when the hour is. No one knows. Not me, not you, not any human, not even the angels in heaven. Not even the Son. Only the Father knows. So he alone is exclusive access to that information, is privy to that information. And then Jesus rounds it out. Be on guard. Be alert. You do not know the time when that time will come. I don't understand. I can't wrap my mind around people who claim to be followers of Christ, who've come up with predictions for the end of the age. I mean, you claim to be a follower of the person who told you point blank you don't know, and then you go around and claim you do. I can't get my mind around that kind of lunacy. So we don't know when it's going to occur. Jesus gives an image of this. It's like a man going away. He leaves his house and puts his servants in charge, each with assigned tasks, and tells the one at the door to keep watch. It's like a man going away. The one who's going away is Christ, is Jesus himself. He leaves his house, that is his people. He puts servants in charge. It's a great allusion to the disciples. Each have their assigned tasks. He tells them to keep watch. Notice that phrase, be on guard and keep watch, be on guard. They're flittering here and there throughout this text. We see it again here in 35. Therefore, keep watch. Pay attention. Stay alert. You don't know when the return of Christ will be. We don't know when the master of the house is coming back. Could be in the evening. Could be at midnight. Could be at the rooster crowing at dawn. We just don't know the hour. We don't know the time. And so we need to have a posture of readiness that Jesus could come back. Theologians would use the phrase imminent to describe the return of Christ. I don't use that word too often. I prefer the word expectancy. We live with the expectation of the return of Christ. I love this phrase. If he comes suddenly, do not let him find you sleeping. Don't want to be caught sleeping on the job. You don't want to be caught morally asleep at the wheel when the master returns. What I say to you, I say to everyone, watch. As I said a few seconds ago, Jesus constantly comes back to that warning. Stay on guard, keep guard, watch out for this, watch out for that, pay attention. It's remarkable how redundant he is. that in every segment of this teaching, every time he touches on a theme, he returns to the central warning. Be alert, pay attention, be on watch, stay on guard. Again, I think we need to strike that all-important balance where we're not trying to read the return of Christ into every event, nor are we so lackadaisical that we lose sight that his return will, in fact, happen. So I think that what we need are less schematics trying to decipher the hour and day of his return, and what we need are more dedicated followers of Christ who go about the mission to reach the nations and who give themselves to this teaching. They really hold within them a abiding hope in the return of Christ. The chaos that we see, the wars and rumors of wars, the famine, the plagues, the all that goes on in this chaotic world can only have its a solution. The only solution to that, the only solution that can be had, that can meet the demands of this incredibly chaotic, dysfunctional, sinful, fallen world. The only thing that can rise to that occasion is the return of the one true King. And so that's what we're living with, that incredible hope. And so I've been debating quite a bit about preaching some end times, return of Christ things in the midst of our current pandemic, in the midst of our current social upheaval. It's timely, I recognize that, but I also don't want to give people the sense that I'm going out on a limb and saying, oh yeah, this is it, we're gearing up, this is the end of the age, Jesus is coming back tomorrow. I don't know when he's coming back. But I do think that if we're going to land on something solid, something biblical, something true, the thing we need to land on is that all of this pandemic, social upheaval, chaos throughout our world, chaos should not challenge our faith. Chaos should confirm our faith. If we saw a world that was coming together, if we saw a world that was full of peace and love and joy, it would really be nice, but it would also be very disconcerting. It would be baffling. Given what we've been told in the Bible about human nature and the return and the end of the age and all these things, that world of utopia and perfection and happy and joy doesn't fit with what we've been told to expect. But the world that we see when we turn on our TVs, when we look online, that's the world we were told to expect. And so it should never come as a shock. It shouldn't come as a shock. If you can find chaos in our world as a confirmation of your faith, you will find daily affirmations, moment by moment, hourly affirmations that what Jesus has told us is true. For the Jewish people who lived centuries ago, Jesus' prediction of the destruction of the temple should have been a confirmation that he was a legitimate prophet of God. Now living 2 millennials ago, living 2 millennials after the time of Christ, being able to watch human beings crack some of the genetic code, being able to watch them harness the power of an atom, we are still incapable of social harmony. We are still incapable of putting an end to war. We are still incapable of putting an end to famine. We are still at an end. And so all of these things that Jesus tells us are going to be there and throw an incredible amount of discord into our lives, where mothers and betray their children, where fathers and mothers rise up and there's all kinds of fighting within the family and so forth. All of that stuff is happening around us all the time. And while it's awful that it's happening, and it breaks our heart that it's happening, it should never break our faith. It should galvanize our faith, reinforce our faith, because we were told by Christ long ago, hey, this is what's going to happen. Be prepared for it. So I want to encourage you, as you flip on your news and you see what's going on in the world around you, I want you to just kind of let it ruminate in your mind, even say these words over and over again. Jesus told me this is what was going to happen. Jesus told me this is what was going to happen. He knew, sitting on a hill on the Mount of Olives 2,000 years ago, the kind of world we would still be living in 2020. He didn't predict jumbo jets, he didn't predict cars, but he pinned with incredible precision what would be going on in the affairs of the world, in the context of the home, and in the hearts of men. Let that be a confirmation of your faith. My challenge for you this week, allow yourself to be grieved by what you are seeing, and allow your faith to be confirmed in what you're seeing in the world around you. I think if you do that, you'll find a way to navigate this crazy world that we now live in. I always want to remind you, praying for you, care about your church family. Thank you for listening in on this Bible study. If there's anything that Pastor Nathaniel or I can do to be a blessing to you and to your family, please let us know. You're in our thoughts and our prayers. And I pray for God's blessing on you all as you study His Word. May His Word grow in your heart. May it be a powerful tool that God uses to change you and I into His likeness. Blessings on you all.